The first time Jed saw the old man, he was trying to drink himself to death with a glass of what looked like engine coolant. It was at the Last Chance Saloon, a rust bucket bar bolted to the side of Gantry 7, a place where dreams went to die and get recycled for spare parts. The old man's name was Silas, and he had the look of a prospector who'd spent too long staring into the void. His eyes were milky, his skin like old parchment stretched over a skull. Jed was nursing his own lukewarm synthale, trying to figure out how to turn 100 credits into the 10,000 he owed a loan shark named Corb. Corb had a habit of collecting debts by repossessing things like kidneys. Jade's daughter Maya was sick back on Triton, a nasty lung fungus that required meds costing more than his whole scrap hauler ship was worth. The weight of it all was a physical thing, pressing down on his chest. Silas staggered over to his table, clutching a small, greasy data chip. "You look like a man running out of road," Silas rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "Looks can be deceiving," Jed lied. "No, they can't," Silas said, and a terrible wet cough shook his thin frame. He slammed the data chip down on the table. It skidded and stopped next to Jed's glass. "This is your road." A new one. Jed looked at the chip. It was an old model, dirty and worn. "What is it?" "A map," Silas wheezed, his eyes darting around the bar as if he expected phantoms to leap from the shadows. "A map to a place that ain't on any chart. A place called Earth." Jed almost laughed. Earth was a myth, a ghost story told to scare rookie pilots, a system designated Uncharted on every official Galactic map, a black hole of information. People who went looking for it never came back. It was a cosmic Bermuda Triangle. "Sure it is, old-timer, and I've got a bridge to sell you on Ganymede." Silas grabbed Jed's wrist. His grip was shockingly strong, cold and bony like a dead thing. "It's real, and it's full of riches, pre-expansion tech. Metals you can't find anywhere else. Enough to make a man a king. I was there." He leaned in close, his breath smelling of decay and cheap booze. "But there's a reason it's marked Uncharted. It's not an accident. It's deliberate." Jed tried to pull his arm away, but the old man held fast. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because I can't go back, and because they followed me." Silas's eyes widened in sheer terror. He wasn't looking at Jed anymore. He was looking through him. "They're already here, listening." "Who's listening?" Jed asked, a chill crawling up his spine. Silas's lips pulled back from his yellowed teeth. "The silence," he whispered. "They don't like noise, they don't like thought. Don't let them hear you think." And then it happened. It wasn't loud, it was horribly quiet. Silas's eyes, which had been milky, suddenly cleared. They became perfect, polished black orbs, reflecting the grimy lights of the bar. A thin trickle of black fluid, thick as oil, leaked from the corner of each eye. Then from his nose, his mouth fell open in a silent scream, and the same black fluid poured out. He didn't make a sound. His body just went rigid, his grip on Jed's arm finally loosening. He slumped forward, his head hitting the table with a dull, heavy thud. The bar went silent for a second. Then the noise rushed back in. A few patrons glanced over, then looked away. A man dying in the Last Chance Saloon wasn't exactly front-page news. But Jed couldn't look away. He stared at the dead man, at the black fluid pooling on the table. And he stared at the greasy little data chip, sitting there like a key to either a kingdom or a coffin. The old man's last words echoed in his head. A hook of ice plunged deep into his gut. "Don't let them hear you think. Jed pocketed the chip. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the shock. Maybe it was the tiny, desperate spark in his soul that refused to be extinguished by debt and despair. He left the bar without a word, leaving the bartender to deal with the body. Back in the cold, sterile corridor of Gantry 7, the old man's words felt less like the ravings of a drunk and more like a prophecy. His ship, the Stardust Drifter, was a hunk of junk. It was an old M-class freighter that had been patched up so many times it looked more like a quilt than a spaceship. Sal, his mechanic, was leaning against the landing gear, wiping grease from his hands with an equally greasy rag. Sal had a face like a bulldog and a heart of gold-plated synth steel. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Jed," Sal grunted. "Something like that," Jed said, his voice hollow. He ran a hand over the scarred hull of his ship. "Home sweet home. Sal, what do you know about the Uncharted sectors? Specifically the one where old Earth is supposed to be." Sal stopped wiping and gave him a hard look. "I know that you don't go there. I know that it's a good way to get your ship and your life erased from the record." "Why?" "Don't tell me you're listening to prospector stories." "Jed pulled out the chip. An old man gave me this. Said it was a map." Sal took the chip, turned it over in his thick fingers. "This thing is ancient. Jed, whatever story he told you, it was a lie to get a free drink. Throw it out the airlock." "He's dead, Sal. He died right in front of me." His eyes, they just sort of melted. That made Sal pause. He looked from the chip to Jed's face. "Okay, that ain't normal. But it still doesn't mean you should go chasing fairy tales. You've got Maya to think about." The name hit Jed like a physical blow. Maya. Her small, pale face, the sound of her labored breathing over the comms last night. The doctors said the fungus was aggressive. The new meds might work, but they weren't cheap. 10,000 credits, a number that might as well have been a billion. "That's why I have to think about this, Sal," Jed said quietly. "I'm out of options." As if on cue, a shadow fell over them. Two figures, one large and brutish, the other weaselly, and holding a datapad blocked the corridor. It was Corb and his muscle, a lump of a man named Grok. Corb smiled a slick, predatory expression. "Jedediah, just the man I wanted to see. I was just calculating your interest. It seems to have grown." "I need more time, Corb," Jed said, his hands balling into fists. "Time is a luxury, Jed. Luxuries cost money." "Money which you do not have," Corb said, his eyes flicking to the Stardust Drifter. "Nice ship, lots of spare parts. Might fetch 1,000 credits. Maybe 1,500 if we include the pilot's organs." Grok cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing in the corridor like breaking bones. Jed's mind was racing. He was trapped. There was no way out. The Gantry authorities wouldn't help. Corb owned them. He looked from Corb's smug face to Sal's worried one, and then his fingers closed around the core data chip in his pocket. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was the only door left in a room with walls closing in. "You'll get your money," Jed said, his voice hard with a resolve he didn't know he had. "All of it, soon." Corb raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? And how do you plan to accomplish this miracle?" Jed stared right through him, his gaze fixed on the endless black of space visible through a nearby viewport. "I'm going on a little prospecting trip." After Corb left, smirking and promising to be back in 1 week to collect, Sal grabbed Jed's arm. "You're not serious. You're gonna get yourself killed." "I'm dead already if I stay here," Jed said. He pulled out the chip and walked toward the ship's ramp. "Help me get the drifter spaceworthy, Sal. One last trip, for Maya. Sal watched him for a long moment, his bulldog face a mask of concern. Finally he sighed, a sound of profound resignation. Fine. But if you ain't back in 2 weeks, I'm selling this rust bucket for scrap myself. And I'm sending the money to your girl. Deal, Jed said. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear. It might have been hope, or it might have been the cold thrill of a man with nothing left to lose. The Stardust Drifter pulled away from Gantry 7 with a groan of protesting metal. Jed watched the station shrink in the viewport until it was just another light among a million others. He was alone now, truly alone. Just him, his ship, and a dead man's ghost map. He slotted the chip into the nav computer's auxiliary port. The system whirred, trying to read the ancient data format. Then, a single set of coordinates appeared on the screen. No star charts, no plotted route, just a destination. It was deep in the Uncharted sector, a vast, dark canvas where the Galactic Cartography Guild had simply painted the word X'd and moved on. Setting the course felt like signing his own death warrant. The autopilot engaged, and the ship's sublight engines hummed with their usual comforting rhythm. But there was no comfort to be found. The silence of the cockpit, usually a welcome friend, felt heavy and oppressive. He kept thinking about Silas's last words. Don't let them hear you think. What did that even mean? He tried to distract himself. He made a cup of bitter reconstituted coffee. He ran a diagnostic on the life support system, which Sal had thankfully patched up. He checked the comms, scrolling through frequencies. Nothing but static. The further he got from civilized space, the quieter it became. The silence was a living thing, growing around the ship like a shroud. On the second day, the weirdness began. It started small, a flicker of the lights on the main console. He blamed it on the drifter's aging power conduits. Then he heard a sound, a whisper, so faint he thought he'd imagined it. It sounded like a child's laugh, lost on the edge of the comm static. He checked the logs. No incoming signals, nothing. He must be tired, stressed, that was it. He tried to sleep, but his dreams were a feverish mess. He saw Maya, but her face was wrong, her eyes like the polished black orbs of the dead prospector. He saw Corb counting out credits made of bone. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The ship was silent, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. On the third day, he was charting their progress when the nav computer screen flickered and changed. For a split second, the coordinates were gone. In their place was a single word, written in a strange flowing script he'd never seen before. Come. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar string of numbers. Jed's blood ran cold. He replayed the system's visual log. The glitch was there, the word. It wasn't a hallucination. Something was communicating with his ship or with him. Don't let them hear you think. He suddenly understood. It wasn't about audible noise. It was about the noise inside his head. His hope, his fear, his desperation for the money for Maya. It was bait. He was a fish on a line, and something was reeling him in. He tried to empty his mind. He focused on the hum of the engine, the blinking of the lights, the feel of the pilot's chair. He tried to think about nothing. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. The silence in his head was terrifying. It felt unnatural. But as he forced his thoughts into a flat gray calm, the ship seemed to settle. The flickering lights stopped. The phantom whispers faded. For the rest of the journey, he lived in a state of forced meditation. He did his duties like an automaton. Eat. Check systems. Sleep. Don't think. Don't hope. Don't fear. He was a machine, a part of the ship. On the fifth day, the proximity alert chimed. He had arrived. He looked at the main viewport, his carefully constructed mental wall crumbling in an instant. There, hanging in the blackness of space, was a planet. It was a swirl of brilliant blue and dazzling white, breathtakingly beautiful. It looked exactly like the old pictures. It was Earth. But something was terribly wrong. There were no lights on the dark side, no satellites glinting in the sun, no chatter of communication signals. His long-range sensors, which should have been screaming with data from a populated world, were eerily quiet. They showed a biosphere teeming with life, off the charts, but the technology reading was zero. Absolutely nothing. It was a ghost planet. A beautiful, silent, impossible ghost, and from its surface he felt it. A pull, a psychic siren song that promised him everything he ever wanted. Enifo. The word wasn't on the screen this time. It was in his head. The welcome was not warm. It was a cold alien caress in the deepest part of his mind. A voice that was not a voice, using his own hopes to speak to him. It showed him an image of Maya, healthy and laughing. It showed him a pile of credits so high he could have swam in it. It promised relief. An end to all his worry. Come down, the thought voice whispered. It is all here for you. Jed's hand trembled as he reached for the controls. Every instinct screamed at him to turn the drifter around and fire the engines until the ship fell apart. But the image of Maya was too strong. The weight of his desperation was too heavy. What if Silas was only half right? What if there was danger but also treasure? What if he could just get down, grab something valuable, and get out before they Silas was scared of even knew he was there? It was the logic of a gambling addict, the reasoning of a drowning man reaching for a razor blade. He knew it, but he did it anyway. Okay, he whispered to the empty cockpit. Okay, let's go see the ghost. He took the ship into the atmosphere. The moment the drifter hit the upper ionosphere, all hell broke loose. The control panels lit up like a festival. Alarms blaring a chaotic symphony of failure. Shields fluctuated. Numb systems went haywire. The ship bucked and shuddered, a wild beast trying to throw him. It felt like the planet itself was actively fighting his technology, trying to tear his ship apart. He wrestled with the controls, his knuckles white. He was flying blind, using nothing but instinct and the view out the front port. He aimed for a vast green swath of land, a continent covered in dense forest. He needed a place to set down where he wouldn't be immediately seen, though he was starting to think there was nothing here to see him. The ship plummeted through the clouds and the ground rushed up to meet him. Trees, an endless ocean of them. He fought to level out the ship, screaming in protest. He managed to pull up just enough to avoid a direct crash, skimming over the treetops before finding a clearing, a small, unnaturally circular meadow. He slammed the ship down hard. The landing gear groaned, bent, but held. Then silence. The alarms cut out. The systems went dead. Every light on the console blinked off. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling metal and his own ragged breathing. He was down. He was on Earth. He looked out the viewport. The clearing was carpeted in thick green grass. It was surrounded by towering trees with dark bark and leaves of 100 different shades of green. The sky above was a piercing, brilliant blue. It was the most beautiful, idyllic place he had ever seen. And it was the most terrifying. The silence was absolute. Not just a lack of engine noise, a lack of life noise. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing, no rustle of animals in the undergrowth. There was only the sound of the wind sighing through the trees. It was a perfect, painted picture of a world, but someone had forgotten to add the soundtrack. It was the silence of a tomb. He sat there for an hour, maybe two, his hand on the emergency reboot sequence for the ship's power. But he didn't press it. He was afraid to. Afraid of what might happen if he made a technological noise. Don't let them hear you think. He was beginning to understand that it applied to more than just thoughts. Finally, he couldn't stand it anymore. The promise of riches, of a cure for Maya, was still a poison in his veins. He had to see. He had to know. He put on a simple environment suit, more for peace of mind than any real need. The ship's sensors had confirmed the air was breathable. He cycled the airlock, the hiss of it sounding like a cannon blast in the oppressive quiet. The ramp lowered with a low hydraulic hum. He took his first step onto the soil of Earth. The ground felt firm beneath his boots. The air smelled clean, loamy, and ancient. He took a few more steps, his gaze sweeping the silent woods. Everything was still. Too still. The trees didn't even seem to sway properly in the wind. They just were. Then he saw it. Through a gap in the trees, not more than a half-mile away, he could see the shapes of buildings. A town. Hope, sharp and stupid, surged through him. Maybe there were people. Maybe there was technology, abandoned but salvageable. He started walking towards it, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The closer he got, the more the wrongness of the place settled in. The town looked handmade. The lines of the buildings were not quite straight. A roof on a small house sagged in the middle, not from age, but as if the builder didn't quite understand the concept of a right angle. The walls of a larger building that might have been a store were smooth and featureless, with no sign of bricks or wood grain. It looked like a child's drawing of a town brought to life. A bad memory of a town. And, standing in the middle of the main street, perfectly still, was a figure. It looked like a person. From this distance it was a silhouette, clad in what looked like simple rustic clothes. Jed's heart leaped. A survivor, a descendant of some lost colony? He raised a hand to wave, then stopped. The silence. The wrongness of the buildings, his instincts, honed by years of navigating treacherous asteroid fields and dealing with shady characters, screamed at him. This was a trap. He ducked behind a large, strangely smooth boulder at the edge of the woods and watched. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, head slightly tilted, as if listening to the wind. Jed pulled a pair of electro-binoculars from his belt and raised them to his eyes. He focused the lens, and the breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a person. The shape was human, yes, but the texture was all wrong. The skin wasn't skin. It looked like a composite of dried leaves, flakes of rust and dust, all pressed together into a human form. The clothes weren't fabric, but were part of it. The same mottled, decaying material. Its face was a vague suggestion of features. 2 dark hollows for eyes, a slash that might be a mouth. It was a scarecrow made of forgotten things. Jed lowered the binoculars, his stomach churning. What was he looking at? Some kind of robot? A native life form that mimicked humans. As he watched, another figure shuffled out of one of the warped buildings. This one was shaped like a woman in a long dress. It moved with a slow, jerky gait, like a poorly operated marionette. It joined the first figure in the street. Then another emerged, and another. Soon there were a dozen of them, all standing in the silent street, all made of the same strange dead material. They stood in a loose gathering, not speaking, not interacting, just waiting. Jed felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. This wasn't a treasure hunt. This was a horror show. He had to get back to the ship. He had to get out of here. He began to back away slowly, careful not to make a sound. That's when the first figure, the man-shaped one, turned its head. It didn't turn like a human. It swiveled its head a full 180 degrees. The motion smooth and utterly silent. Its hollow eyes seemed to stare directly at the boulder Jed was hiding behind. A wave of pure terror washed over him. It knew he was there. Jed didn't wait. He turned and ran. He crashed through the underbrush, the unnatural silence of the forest, broken by his panicked flight. He didn't care about noise anymore. He just needed to get away. He glanced back over his shoulder. The Leaf and Lust people were moving. They weren't running. They were just walking, shuffling forward with that same jerky, unnatural gait. But they were coming. And they were moving faster than they should have been able to. He burst into the clearing. The Stardust Drifter, a beautiful, solid promise of safety. He scrambled up the ramp, his hands fumbling for the control to raise it. It whined in protest, but began to ascend. Through the shrinking gap, he saw them. The figures had reached the edge of the clearing. They stopped, standing in a line at the boundary between the forest and the meadow, their blank faces turned towards his ship. Jed slammed the airlock shut and sprinted to the cockpit. He threw himself into the pilot's chair and slammed his fist on the emergency power reboot. Nothing happened. He hit it again and again. The ship was dead. Not just powered down, it felt inert. Like a block of solid metal, the complex machinery around him was no more sophisticated than the rock he'd hidden behind. He looked out the viewport. The figures hadn't moved. They were just watching, waiting. And in his mind, the cold voice returned. No longer a whisper, but a calm, certain statement. You cannot leave. A new image flooded his brain. Not of Maya or money. It was a memory. His memory. He was a small boy running through a field on Triton, his mother calling his name. It was one of his happiest memories. But the memory was being eaten. The edges of it were fraying, turning gray and dissolving into static. The feeling of joy and warmth was being siphoned away, leaving a cold, hollow ache behind. He clutched his head, crying out in pain and violation. It was feeding on him, on his past, on his very soul. Silas hadn't just been chased by them. He'd been partially consumed. That was why he was a husk of a man. They had eaten his memories, his vitality, piece by piece. The Uncharted label on the map wasn't a warning to stay away. It was a quarantine sign, a desperate ancient attempt to seal off a predator that didn't just kill you. It erased you. And he had just flown himself right into the center of its cage. Panic was a physical thing, a wild animal clawing at the inside of his chest. He had to get the power on. He tore open a service panel below the console, ignoring the dead, dark wires. He went for the manual ignition sequence, a last-ditch mechanical override that bypassed the main computer. It was a series of heavy, clanking levers and switches, designed for precisely this kind of catastrophic failure. He pulled the first lever. It was stiff, but it moved with a satisfying clunk. He reached for the second as his fingers closed around the cold metal. A new vision hit him, stronger than the last. He was standing in the infirmary on Triton, the day Maya was diagnosed, the doctor's face full of professional pity. The smell of antiseptic, the crushing weight of the diagnosis. The memory was so vivid, he could almost feel the cold floor beneath his feet. Then the feeding began again. The doctor's face blurred, the words turning to meaningless drones. The feeling of dread and love for his daughter was being sucked out of him, replaced by a dull, empty confusion. It was like his past was being unwritten. "No," he gasped, stumbling back from the console. "Get out of my head." "Give us more," the collective voice sighed in his mind. "Your fears are so flavorful." He looked out the viewport again. The Leaf and Rust people were still there, but now there were more of them, dozens, maybe hundreds, ringing the clearing, and they were changing. One of them now had a vague impression of his own face on its rust and dust features. Another was slowly taking on the shape of Corb, the loan shark. They were using his memories to build new puppets. He was the raw material. He realized the terrible truth. The thing on this planet, this psychic entity, this mimic. It was a predator that didn't hunt with teeth and claws. It hunted with telepathy. It lured its prey in with psychic whispers of their greatest desires, broadcast out into the void. Desperate prospectors, fleeing criminals, heartbroken lovers. Anyone with a strong enough emotion was a shining beacon for it. It drew them in and then it trapped them, disabled their technology and slowly, leisurely fed on their consciousness. The bodies, the town, they were just trophies, echoes of past meals. Jed felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He was not going to be food. He was not going to be a puppet in this silent, dusty horror show. He had to fight back. But how do you fight something that's inside your own head? Don't let them hear you think. Silas's words came back to him, and this time he finally truly understood. It wasn't just about emptying his mind. It was about controlling what was in it. His hopes, his fears, his complex memories. That was the gourmet meal it craved. It was like ringing a dinner bell. So what if he gave it something else? Something it couldn't digest. He closed his eyes, ignoring the phantom images it was trying to force on him. He shut out the memory of Maya's face. He shut out the fear of Corb. He forced his mind down, into the cold, hard mechanics of his ship. He didn't think about flying the ship. He thought about the engineering schematics. Primary fusion initiator requires a 7.2-second charge from the secondary capacitor bank, he thought, focusing on the words, the technical jargon, as if it were a prayer. The capacitor bank itself is regulated by 3 parallel power conduits, each shielded with grade -4 tungsten alloy. The pressure in his head lessened slightly. The voice of the mimic was still there, but it was confused, like an animal sniffing at a food it didn't recognize. "What is this?" it seemed to ask. "This is not fear. This is not joy. It is cold, empty." Jed pressed on, his mind a litany of technical specifications. He visualized the flow of energy, not as a means to escape, but as a pure abstract concept, a diagram. He pictured coolant flowing through pipes, the molecular structure of the ship's hull, the precise voltage required for the nav computer. He became a living textbook, a technical manual. He moved back to the manual override levers, his mind a blank slate of engineering data. He pulled the second lever, then the third. A deep shuddering groan came from the guts of the ship. A single light flickered on the console. It was the auxiliary power indicator. It was weak, pathetic, but it was there. The psychic pressure redoubled, a furious assault. The mimic was realizing what he was doing. It threw his worst fears at him. An image of Maya, her lungs failing, gasping for air. The sound of Corb's laughter as he tore the ship apart. But Jed clung to his new mantra. Hull integrity at 97%. Atmospheric pressure stable. Oxygen mix at 20.7%. He was a machine. He was the Stardust Drifter. His thoughts were nothing but status reports. One by one, the ship's systems began to come back online, sputtering and weak, but alive. The main reactor was still dead. But the emergency thrusters, which ran on a separate chemically based system, were now showing a flicker of green on the board. Escape is not permitted. The voice in his head boomed, a sound of pure frustrated rage. It was losing its grip. Its food was fighting back in a way it had never encountered before. He ignored it. Chemical thruster ignition sequence initiated. Propellant mix. Hydrazine and dinitrogen tetroxide. Thrust vector alignment now. He slammed his hand down on the thruster control. The ship screamed. Not the shriek of failing systems, but the raw, physical roar of the chemical thrusters firing. The Stardust Drifter lurched upwards, a clumsy, staggering leap off the ground. It wasn't a graceful liftoff. It was a desperate jump. The ship rose 50 feet, 100, tilting violently to one side. Through the viewport, Jed saw the ground below him ripple. It wasn't an earthquake. The entire meadow, the very soil and grass, was undulating like the surface of a disturbed liquid. The circle of leaf and rust people dissolved, melting back into the ground, which was now a churning brown and green sea of something. The planet itself, the mimic. It was one single, planet-sized organism. The trees, the grass, the dirt. It was all part of its body. The puppets were just extensions of itself, temporary limbs. A psychic scream of pure, thwarted hunger ripped through Jed's mind. It was a sound so awful it was beyond sound, a feeling of being hated by a god. It almost shattered his concentration. He gritted his teeth, blood trickling from his nose from the sheer mental strain. Main thruster offline. Attitude control failing. Switching to manual stabilizers, he thought, his mind clinging to the technical jargon like a lifeline. He fought the controls, trying to keep the ship pointing up. The ship climbed, slow and agonizingly loud. Below, the entire forest began to writhe. Trees bent and twisted at impossible angles, lashing out like giant whips, trying to swat him out of the sky. The idyllic landscape had transformed into a Lovecraftian nightmare. It was a living, malevolent world trying to kill him. He had to get higher. He had to break out of the atmosphere before the ship was torn apart, or his mind simply gave out. He risked a glance at the data chip from Silas, still slotted in the auxiliary port. It was glowing with a faint, pulsing light. On impulse, he activated the port's data copy function, hoping to download whatever was on it. A single, heavily encrypted file began to transfer to the ship's black box. It was a tiny file, but the transfer was crawling, as if the planet's psychic interference was slowing it down. A massive, tree-like tendril whipped past the cockpit, missing him by inches. The ship rocked violently. External impact detected on port quarter. No hull breach. Stabilizing, he chanted in his head, his hands flying across the controls. The psychic assault changed tactics. It stopped throwing fear at him and started using his most precious memory. Maya. Her voice filled his head, clear as day. "Daddy, where are you? It's dark, I'm scared." Jay's concentration wavered. A tear escaped his eye. This was a low blow, a cruel, vicious attack. Please, Daddy, come back. Don't leave me. You're not real, he whispered, his voice cracking. To fight it, he did the most painful thing he could imagine. He took the memory of Maya, the real memory of her smile, her laugh, the feel of her small hand in his, and he locked it away. He put it in a mental box, wrapped it in chains, and shoved it into the darkest corner of his mind where he couldn't feel it, couldn't access it. He made himself forget her just for a moment. He hollowed himself out, leaving nothing but the cold equations of escape. The voice in his head faltered, confused by the sudden void where his love for his daughter used to be. The ship broke through the upper cloud layer. The sky was turning from blue to the deep indigo of near space. He was almost there. The data transfer from Silas's chip finally completed. Just as a red light blinked on the console, the chip had overloaded and burned out, its contents now hopefully safe in the drifter's hardened black box. With one final shuddering push, the Stardust drifter broke free of Earth's atmosphere. The psychic scream cut off abruptly, like a severed cord. The silence that replaced it was the most beautiful sound Jed had ever heard. He was out. He was free. He floated in the blackness, the damaged ship tumbling slowly. Below him, the blue and white marble of Earth looked peaceful and serene once more. A perfect lie. He stared at it, his mind a hollowed-out cavern. He had survived, but he felt like a ghost. He had won by sacrificing the very things that made him human. Slowly, carefully, he unlocked the box in his mind. The memory of Maya rushed back in, and with it, an agony of grief and relief so profound. He broke down, sobbing uncontrollably in the silent, lonely cockpit of his broken ship. The journey back to Gantry 7 was a blur of numb autopilot and cheap, strong coffee. The Stardust drifter was crippled. The main reactor was fried beyond repair, and he was running on the last dregs of the emergency chemical fuel, moving at a snail's pace. But every kilometer he put between himself and that beautiful, horrible planet felt like a victory. His mind was scarred. He kept finding empty spots in his memory. Small things, like the name of his third-grade teacher or what he'd eaten for breakfast 3 days ago. The mimic had taken those. Little bites out of his past. The bigger memories, the ones he'd used to fight back with, felt thin and worn. Like old photographs handled too many times, he was less than he had been when he left. When he finally limped into Gantry 7's docking bay, he was met by Sal, whose face was a mixture of disbelief and immense relief. "Jed, by the stars, I never thought I'd see you again," Sal exclaimed, rushing up the ramp as it lowered. He stopped short when he saw Jed's face. "What happened to you? You look like you've aged 20 years. "Long trip," Jed said, his voice raspy. "The ship's a wreck, Sal. I don't think she'll ever fly again." "Forget the ship," Sal said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" Jed just shook his head, unable to find the words. He walked past his friend and headed straight for the Gantry's public data terminal. He needed to see the file from Silas's chip. He needed to understand. He plugged his personal datapad into the ship's black box and transferred the encrypted file. It took him 2 hours of cross-referencing old hacker code to break the encryption. When the file finally opened, it wasn't a map or a treasure log. It was a warning, a final desperate message from a long-dead civilization. The text was simple, ancient, and terrifying. It called the entity on Earth the solitude that hungers. It described how the entity was a psychic predator of immense power, perhaps as old as the galaxy itself. It didn't expand or build empires, it simply waited. Its hunting ground was the entire galaxy. Its lure the siren song of hope and despair it broadcast into the minds of sentient beings. The message explained that this ancient race had fought a war against it. A war they could not win. They couldn't destroy it without destroying the planet, and they couldn't contain it. Any ship, any technology that got too close was neutralized. Any mind that touched it was consumed. So they did the only thing they could. They hid it. They erected a massive galaxy-spanning network of psychic dampeners. A kind of mental fence. They hacked galactic maps, erasing the system's data, replacing it with an Uncharted designation. They created the myth of it being a cosmic death trap, a dangerous void, all to keep people away. It was a deliberate, desperate, multi-millennia act of quarantine. But the quarantine was failing. The psychic dampeners were old, decaying. The mimic song was beginning to leak through, fainter than it once was, but still potent enough to catch the desperate, the greedy, and the foolish. Prospectors like Silas, scrap haulers like him. The final line of the text chilled him to the bone. The silence must be kept. The lie must be maintained. For if the galaxy ever learns what waits at Sol -3, they will not see a monster to be quarantined. They will see a weapon to be controlled, and that will be the end of all thought. Jed sat back, the datapad slipping from his fingers. He finally understood. The Uncharted label wasn't just to protect the galaxy from Earth. It was also to protect Earth from the galaxy. Imagine what a warlord, what a ruthless empire would do with a planet-sized telepath. They would try to harness it, to use it, and they would fail, unleashing a hungry god upon a galaxy full of minds. He was suddenly burdened with a secret of galactic importance. A secret that had killed Silas and countless others. A secret he could never, ever tell. His personal comm chimed. It was a message from Triton. From the infirmary. His heart seized. He opened it with trembling hands. It was a bill, a final notice. Corb had apparently called them, informing them that Jed's credit was no good. They were taking Maya off the expensive medication. She had 2 days before they switched her to basic palliative care. He looked at the bill, at the cold clinical numbers. Then he looked at the data on his pad, the secret that could doom trillions. All his pain, all his sacrifice had been for nothing. He had escaped the monster, but he was still trapped. Jed walked out of the data terminal and into the grimy, neon-lit hustle of Gantry 7. He felt like a ghost, invisible to the laughing spaces and grizzled merchants who passed him by. They were all living in a fragile, protected world, and they didn't even know it. They didn't know about the hungry silence waiting in the dark. He had a choice, a terrible, impossible choice. Farnain Urisinazero from the Drifter, the detailed atmospheric composition of Earth. To any major corporation or government, that data on a pristine, virgin world would be worth a fortune. More than enough to pay for Maya's treatment 10 times over. He could save his daughter. All he had to do was put a crack in the quarantine wall. All he had to do was point a finger at the beautiful, deadly planet and let the galaxy's greed do the rest. Or he could protect a secret. He could let Maya. He couldn't even finish the thought. He walked for what felt like hours, his feet leading him to the darkest, quietest corner of the station, an old observation deck that was no longer in use. He stood before the thick plasteel window looking out at the starfield. One of those faint, anonymous lights was Sol, Earth's sun. His personal demon. He thought about the mimic. He thought about its cold, consuming hunger. He thought about the leaf and rust puppets, animated by stolen memories. He thought about the final, horrifying warning from that ancient race. They will see a weapon to be controlled. What would happen if the Zelos hegemony or the Signian Empire got wind of this? They would send armadas, not to explore, but to conquer, to capture the mimic. They would throw ships and soldiers at it, feeding it, making it stronger, until it learned to fight back on their terms, or until one of them, in a moment of hubris, broke its cage. And what about the people on those ships? The soldiers, the scientists. They all had families, memories, hopes. They would all become food. An entire galaxy of minds, open and vulnerable. He pulled up the image of Maya on his datapad, her smile, the little gap between her front teeth, the way her eyes lit up when he told her stories about the stars. He had locked this memory away to survive. Now it was a knife in his heart. Could he sacrifice the galaxy for this one precious girl? He thought about his own mind, the blank spots and frayed edges. He was proof of the monster's existence. He was the evidence. A new thought, a cold and practical one, formed in his mind. It was a plan born of utter desperation, a high-wire act with no safety net. He went back to his ship. Sal was there trying to coax some life out of the dead reactor. "It's no good, Jed. She's cold iron," Sal said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I know," Jed said. "I need you to pull the black box, and I need you to wipe every log from the ship's internal memory. Everything except the flight recorder that shows my trip from here to the edge of the Uncharted sector and back. Make it look like I went out, found nothing, and barely made it home." Sal looked at him confused. "But the money? Your daughter?" "I have another plan," Jed said. He couldn't meet his friend's eyes. He took the black box, a heavy, hardened metal cube, and went to the most notorious information broker on Gantry 7, a slimy Rhodian named Flix. Flix's office was a cramped, dark room that smelled of ozone and secrets. "I have something for you, Flix," Jed said, placing the black box on the desk. Flix's large black eyes blinked slowly. "Many people bring me things, most are worthless." "This isn't," Jed said, his voice steady. "It's partial sensor data from a rogue planetoid I found on the edge of the Uncharted sector. Rich in heavy metals, very rich. The full data got corrupted when my ship was damaged by a gravimetric shear. It was a lie, but it was a good one, plausible." Flix plugged the box into his terminal. He whistled, a low fluting sound. "The mineral readings, they are off the charts. Platinum, iridium, osmium. This is a major find, if it's real." "It's real," Jed said. "But the location is corrupted. I can't find it again. So the data is incomplete. A tease. I'm not selling it to a corporation for a big payday. I'm selling it to you right now for a small one." Flix stared at him, his clever mind working. He understood. Jed wasn't offering a treasure map. He was offering a rumor. A very, very valuable rumor that Flix could sell, piece by piece, to a dozen different prospecting outfits, starting a mini gold rush to a sector of space that was completely empty. Flix would get rich, and the prospectors would find nothing, but not before he'd taken their money. It was a perfect, untraceable scam. "How much?" Flix asked. 15,000 credits, Jed said. "Now." Flix smiled. "A pleasure doing business with you, Jedediah Stone." Jed walked out with a credit chip heavy in his pocket. He had done it. He hadn't revealed the location of Earth. He had only sold the ghost of its riches, a lie wrapped in a kernel of truth. He had pointed the greedy not at Earth, but at a wild goose chase in an empty quadrant. He had protected the secret. He immediately transferred 10,000 credits to the Triton Infirmary. The confirmation message came back moments later. Maya's treatment was reinstated. He had saved her. He had saved the galaxy, but as he stood there, the credit chip feeling cold in his hand, he did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had stared into the abyss and had just managed to sell its shadow. A week later, Jed was back where it all began, sitting in the Last Chance saloon. The place hadn't changed. It still smelled of stale synthale and regret. The Stardust Drifter had been sold for scrap, as Sal had warned. The money, combined with what was left from Flix, was enough to book passage to Triton, for him and to keep Maya's treatments going for the foreseeable future. He was no longer in debt. He was no longer a captain. He was just a man. A haunted man. He was nursing a glass of real whiskey, a rare extravagance. He could afford it now. He stared into the amber liquid, but he didn't see his reflection. He saw a blue and white planet. He heard a silence that screamed. Sal sat down opposite him, placing 2 glasses on the table. He pushed one towards Jed. "Heard you're heading out tomorrow." "Yeah," Jed said, "going to see my girl." "You did it, Jed. Whatever you had to do, you did it." Sal looked at him, his expression serious. "You never told me what you found out there." Jed took a long sip of whiskey. The burn was good. It was real. "Nothing, Sal. You were right. Just ghost stories and empty space. I got lucky. Bounced a sensor beam off a stray asteroid that had some valuable stuff in it. Sold the data. That's all." It was the lie he would have to tell for the rest of his life. The lie that kept the galaxy safe. Sal nodded slowly, though his eyes said he didn't fully believe it. But he was a good enough friend not to push. "Well, to luck then." They drank in silence for a few minutes. The noise of the bar, which had once been a source of anxiety, was now a comfort. It was the sound of life. The sound of minds full of mundane thoughts, petty grievances, and simple joys. It was the sound of a galaxy that was not being eaten. As he was about to leave, he saw a young woman at the bar. She had the same look he'd had, the same desperation. Her clothes were worn, her eyes wide and scanning the room. She was talking to a grizzled old cargo pilot, who was looking at a star chart on a datapad. Jed felt a faint cold tingle at the back of his skull. A psychic itch. It was so faint most would never notice it, but he knew what it was. It was the song, the lure. Leaking through the ancient failing quarantine, the mimic, still fishing. And this young woman, full of hope and fear, was a shining beacon. The old pilot pointed to a black empty space on the chart. "They say there's fortunes to be made in the Uncharted sectors, kid. If you've got the guts." The woman's eyes lit up with a dangerous, foolish spark. Jed felt a cold weight settle in his gut. His work wasn't over. It was just beginning. He had escaped the prison, but now he was its warden. He was the keeper of the silence. He walked over to their table. The old pilot scowled at him. "What do you want?" Jed ignored him and looked at the young woman. He saw his own desperate face reflected in her eyes. "I heard you talking about the Uncharted sectors," Jed said, his voice low and steady. "My name is Jed. I was out there. Just got back." The woman leaned forward, her attention rapt. "Really? What did you find?" "You couldn't fight a god with the truth. You had to fight it with a better lie." It's a graveyard, he whispered, his eyes wide with fake terror. Full of ghost ships. They say a psychic plague lives out there. It gets in your head, drives you mad, rots your ship from the inside out. I barely escaped, lost everything. He watched the hope in her eyes flicker and die, replaced by a healthy, sensible fear. She looked at the old pilot, then back at Jed's haunted face, his scarred mind, the truth of his terror plain for her to see, even if the reasons were a lie. I see, she stammered, pushing her chair back. Thank you. I think I'll look for work somewhere safer. She got up and hurried out of the bar. The old pilot grumbled about him, scaring off a potential partner. Jed just sat there finishing his whiskey. He had become Silas. He was the crazy old prospector with a terrifying story. It was his job now to stand guard at the edge of the map, to be the ghost story, to protect the silence and the lie, one desperate soul at a time, because he knew what was hiding in the quiet, uncharted dark, and he knew that some secrets must be kept, no matter the cost. He was no longer a scrap hauler. He was a lighthouse keeper, and his job was to warn ships away from the most beautiful, deadly shore in the entire galaxy.